Her whole story is that she's kidnapped and taken to the underworld, to the land of the dead, and raped, essentially. Hαίrete, friends. Welcome to Classics in Color, your weekly dive into some of the ancient world's wackiest facts. I'm Mark Graves, and today we'll be taking a look at the dark side of marriage in the ancient world. Obviously, there was no Hallmark in the ancient world, so I don't think any of you would be shocked to hear that weddings were not the romantic extravaganza that they sometimes are in the modern world. But you're probably not aware of just how dark and gloomy and connected with death the imagery and the myths around weddings were. Now, in this video, I don't mean to imply that every wedding in the real life was super gloomy and spooky, but we're mostly going to be focusing on the myths around weddings and marriages, and a surprising number of these are very dark, very gloomy, and end horribly. Now, there's probably an infinite number of reasons for why that is, and I by no means mean to argue that there's one that is the right one. But one theory that I have heard for why there are so many gloomy stories about marriage, other than it's the ancient world. Every story about everything is super pessimistic, but one more specific theory that I have heard is that there was a lot of real anxiety in the ancient world about getting married, about marriage, and we see that fear that things could go terribly, terribly wrong expressed in all of these myths. And if you want to see that theory explored more, then I would recommend that you read ancient Greek medical and mythical constructions of the interaction between women's experience of sex and birth. It's a long title, I know, but it's a good read, and it is by Mary Bakhvarova. First off, the imagery is kind of creepy. It overlaps a little too much with the imagery that they use for funerals. Now, it's possible that this is coincidental. We use flowers in both funerals and weddings in the modern world, and it's not creepy at all. But I think, and I've seen some scholars who also think, that this overlap of imagery and ritual shows that in the ancient world, they didn't compartmentalize life so much. So for us, birth, wedding, and death, we keep pretty separate and compartmentalized. In the ancient world, it seems like they saw these things as much more interconnected. So, to give you an example, wailing is something that was very important to birth, rituals around birth, and rituals around weddings, and rituals around funerals. Which for us is weird, right? First off, we don't even like wailing. If you're gonna loud, ugly cry, we want you to do that in private. It makes everybody uncomfortable. If you're gonna publicly cry, you gotta do it like nice into a tissue. Not so in the ancient world. It's completely the opposite. If someone in your family dies, you better be loud, ugly crying to show how much you love them, right? So it's not surprising that wailing is an important part of ancient funerals, but it is kind of weird that it is equally important for births and for weddings. People, especially the women who surround the wedding and the birth, are expected to publicly make a lot of noise and do a lot of loud, ugly crying. And there's just this weird, interesting overlap between those three big moments in people's lives. To show you an actual example of this overlap, let's take a second to look at Virgil's Aeneid. So this is a Latin poem, and it's about the hero Aeneas, and he does a lot of things in this poem, but one of the things he does is he hangs out with this lady named Dido for a while. She has a major crush on him, and they can't get together for political reasons. It's sort of a forbidden love, but one day they're out hunting together, and there's a thunderstorm, and they get caught in a cave sheltering from the storm, and they have some nice, sexy times. And Dido, after this, considers them to be married, and Aeneas not so much. So Virgil, the author, goes out of his way to describe, while these sexy times are happening, that the nymphs in the area are making this wailing noise for Dido. So they are sort of acknowledging, oh, this is a marriage thing that's going on, but it is definitely meant to be gloomy and foreboding, because we all know that this marriage is not going to last, that it is doomed from the start, and also that Dido is going to end up dead very soon. So this wailing is for her wedding of sorts, but it is also for her death. So hopefully you can see the weird foreshadowing overlap that I'm trying to get at here. Next up is the loosening of the girdle. So girdle is a garment that women in ancient Greece wore around their middles, kind of under their breasts, and you would loosen this garment in 3 particularly significant scenarios, right? So the first one, pretty obvious, is when you're getting married and you're having sex, you want to loosen your underwear a little bit, probably. Number 2 is if you're going to give birth. You also probably want to loose your clothes a little bit. So loosening the girdle is symbolic of both of those things, but it's also symbolic of a third thing, and that is of... So there's actually kind of a gendered, or there are gendered ways to commit in the ancient world. So if you're a gentleman, you're expected to probably stab yourself or have a friend to stab you. If you're a lady, there's this weird stereotype that women like to or should commit by strangulation, by hanging themselves. And women in the ancient world who all wear girdles all have this garment that is, serviceable for facilitating that action. So loosening one's girdle is symbolic not only of sex and marriage, of birth, but also of and death. An interesting story where this parallel gets illustrated is in Antigone. So Antigone is the daughter of Oedipus, and after Oedipus figures out his horrible fate and sort of banishes himself, he leaves this political vacuum. So Antigone's uncle and her brothers are kind of in a civil war, trying to fight out who is going to be in charge now that Oedipus is gone. And Antigone really loves her brothers, but she's also engaged to the king's son, so to her cousin, and she's got kind of this conflict of interest. But when her uncle manages to kill one of her brothers in this war, he also makes this decree that no one in the kingdom is allowed to bury her brother. And this is a huge violation of ancient religion and etiquette. So she has a major problem with this, and she decides to disobey the order and bury her brother. And when the king hears about this, he has to sort of stand up for his decree. So he orders that she is going to be buried alive. Horrible fate, right? But his son and her fiance argues with the king about this and says, hey, no, chill. We don't need to bury her alive. She's my fiance, Dad. Can you cut her some slack? And the king sort of at the last second decides, okay, fine, we're not going to bury her alive. Go get her and tell her that I'm going to pardon her. And when his son goes to find her, he finds that she has committed by hanging. So she is this person who was about to be a bride, going to be a bride, but instead of loosening her girdle for that reason, loosened her girdle for the other. And the play and the stories around this definitely play with that parallel in the imagery and the symbolism. So we've talked about Dido and Antigone, but there are many other brides that also have interesting stories in Greek and Roman mythology. So Persephone, obviously, she is sort of the quintessential or archetypal, if you will, bride in these myths. And her whole story is that she's kidnapped and taken to the underworld, to the land of the dead, and raped, essentially. And she does get to go back into the overworld, but she is doomed to keep having to return to the land of the dead. And she is the patron goddess of young women, especially young women who are getting married and becoming mothers for the first time. And so all of those young ladies in the ancient world then adopt all of that symbolism and imagery as well. There is also Medea, who has to kill and chop her brother into little pieces so that she can elope and escape with Jason. There are the Danaides, who are 50 sisters who all kill their husbands on their wedding night, which is all the same night, and then they get doomed in the underworld to carry water in sieves for eternity, and etc., etc. There are so many stories that are about brides killing people, being killed. It's a bloodbath. It's spooky. And hopefully you are beginning to see the connection between marriage and death. To be fair, in the real world, there were a lot of dangers that went along with getting married, the most obvious being that childbirth is the usual or expected result of marriage. And before modern medicine, and still to some extent today, childbirth is very dangerous and painful. Let's take a look at a passage from Diseases on Women by Hippocrates that describes a woman going through some complications. From when these things are thus, she is driven mad by the violent inflammation, and she is made murderous by the putrefaction, and she is fearful and anxious by reason of the gloom, and strangulations result from the pressure around the cardia and the spirit. Distraught and anguished by reason of the badness of the blood is drawn toward evil. And another thing, she addresses by name fearful things, and they order her to jump about and to fall down into wells and to be strangled, as if it were better and had every sort of advantage. And whenever they are without visions, there is a kind of pleasure that makes her desire death, as if it were some sort of good. So Hippocrates seems to be describing some sort of mental illness that women would suffer from when they are under all of the physical and social pressures that marriage and childbirth bring. Speaking of social pressures, this did not just come from the bride's family or from the groom. These could often come from the state. So cities, states would have laws governing not just marriage, but procreation as well. So, for example, Solon put into effect a law that if a girl was orphaned, she had to marry whatever male relative she had left surviving to keep her family's property within her family, so to sort of govern inheritance. And Athens had a law that married couples had to engage in procreation at least once a month, I guess, to encourage procreation and increasing population in the state. So there was just a lot of pressure on women in these regards. While I was researching and making this video, I've definitely been thinking about the similar modern trope of corpse brides, bride of Frankenstein, ghost brides. There's so many ghosts that are brides and have like the creepy veil and everything. And it definitely makes me wonder if that's just a coincidence or if there are some parallels or some connections at the roots of both of these stereotypes or tropes, I guess. I have no idea, but I think it's interesting and I'm wondering if any of you have some theories or some thoughts about that. So leave those thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for checking out this video. Special thank you as always to subscribers and to Patreon members, and I hope to see all of you again next week. Hαίrete.